The smell of sugar-soaked rags and scorched engine oil hung heavy in the freezing mist of the Hood River Valley. Marlene knelt in the mud, her fingers trembling as she pulled a handful of blue-stained fabric from the tractor's mangled fuel line. Behind her, the massive sorting machine, the only thing standing between her family's legacy and total bankruptcy, groaned once and fell silent, its belt sliced clean through as if by a razor. A shadow moved in the fog, followed by the slow, rhythmic crunch of gravel. Her brother Elias stepped into the light of the barn, his face a mask of practiced sympathy as he tucked a sharp pocket knife into his jacket. "You're looking tired, Marlene," he whispered, his voice smooth as a funeral oration. "Dad always said the pressure would break you eventually. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and just let go." As the harvest festival lights flickered in the distance, Marlene realized the predator wasn't the corporation at her gates. It was the blood relative standing in her kitchen. The kitchen sink groaned under the weight of last night's dishes, water pooling around the rusted drain. Marlene wiped her palms on her apron, flour dust clinging to the frayed hem, before prying the lid off the sugar jar. Empty. Again. She exhaled through her nose, fingers tightening around the chipped ceramic until the rim bit into her skin. Outside, the screen door banged shut, a sharp report that echoed through the drafty house like a gunshot. Heavy boots thudded across the porch, followed by the wet schlick of mud being scraped off soles. Her brother, Dale, stood in the doorway, his denim jacket dark with rain, the collar turned up against the draft. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he tossed a crumpled envelope onto the table. It skidded across the oilcloth, stopping just short of the salt shaker. "Postman left this at the gate," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Didn't want to bring it in." Marlene didn't reach for it. The envelope's corner was already damp, the ink bleeding into the paper like a bruise. She knew what it was. The same as the last three. The same as the ones she'd burned in the stove when the kids were asleep. The bank didn't care about the frost that had killed the blossoms in April. Nor did they care about the silence Thomas had left behind when his heart stopped in the middle of the North Orchard. They only cared about the numbers. The red ink that now seemed to stain everything she touched. She stepped out of the kitchen, leaving the envelope where it lay, and headed toward the orchard. The fog was a thick, cloying milk that morning, swallowing the gnarled branches of the apple trees until they looked like skeletal fingers reaching out of the earth. The grass, heavy with dew, lashed at the shafts of her rubber boots, leaving dark, weeping stains on her canvas trousers. There was a scent in the air that made her stomach turn. The sickly, sweet rot of overripe windfalls, mixing with the sharp, cold smell of wet bark. It was the smell of a harvest going to waste, of a legacy turning to mulch. At the edge of the property, the wrought iron gate stood as a rusted sentinel. Tangled in the metalwork, another yellow slip fluttered in the wind. Her fingers trembled as she tore it free. Critical arrears. The words were stamped in a red, so bright it hurt her eyes against the gray Oregon sky. She pressed the paper against her chest, the chill of the mist seeping through her coat. She could feel the ghost of Thomas's wedding ring on the chain around her neck, a cold weight that reminded her of every promise she was currently breaking. The orchard didn't just need her. It needed the machines. She trudged toward the high-roofed hangar, her boots sinking into the greasy mud of the work yard. Inside, the sorting machine sat like the carcass of a beached whale. It was a massive, rusted assembly of belts and rollers that had once hummed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Now, it was silent. Marlene dropped to her knees on the cold concrete, a wrench clattering from her numb fingers and echoing off the corrugated tin walls. She reached into the gut of the tractor parked beside it, her hand tracing the shredded remains of a drive belt. The rubber was frayed, worn down to the wire, a perfect mirror of her own nerves. "Work, damn you," she whispered, her voice cracking. Without the mechanical lungs of the sorter, the fruit would sit in the bins until the skins broke and the wasps moved in. She could almost see the apples in the trees above her, thousands of them, pulling the branches down toward the dirt. They were beautiful this year, deep crimsons and bright golds. But without the money for the taxes, they were nothing but future compost. The sound of a heavy engine interrupted her thoughts. A black, lacquered SUV tore into the driveway, its tires spitting gravel against the side of the house. It looked like a predatory insect against the backdrop of the weathered barn. Two men stepped out, their charcoal gray suits so crisp they seemed to repel the damp air. They walked with a ginger, high-stepping gait, trying to avoid the puddles as if the very soil of the Whitaker farm was infectious. Marlin stood up, wiping grease onto her thighs. One of the men, a younger fellow with a haircut that cost more than her monthly power bill, held out a leather-bound folder. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We represent Northwood Agri-Systems. We've been monitoring the local listings. It's a tragedy, what happened to your husband, truly. But the bank is moving fast. We're prepared to offer a settlement that would clear your debts and leave you with a modest nest egg." Marlin snatched the folder. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the men. They weren't looking at the trees. They were looking at the slope of the hill, calculating how many square feet of warehouse space could fit where the Honeycrisps grew. They saw a carcass, and they were the crows. "A modest nest egg," she repeated, the words tasting like copper. She threw the folder onto the hood of their pristine car, leaving a smear of black tractor grease across the finish. "The harvest festival is in 3 weeks. Those apples are going to pay the bank. You can take your settlement and your suits and get off my land." The older man sighed, a sound of practiced disappointment. "The market is flooded, Marlin. You don't have the crew. You don't have the equipment. Be reasonable." "Get out," she shouted, her finger pointing toward the gates. "Before I find a pitchfork that still works." As the SUV backed out, its exhaust a foul cloud in the clean mountain air, Marlene felt a surge of adrenaline that quickly faded into a hollow ache. She was alone. Truly alone. Then came the sound of another vehicle, not the high-pitched whine of a corporate engine, but the familiar, rhythmic rattle of a vintage pickup. It pulled up beside the porch, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, she thought of Thomas. But the man who stepped out was too lean, his movements too calculated. It was Elias. Her brother had been gone for 5 years, chasing shadows in the city. But here he was, stepping into the mud in a jacket that looked like it had never seen a day's labor. "Marlene," he said, spreading his arms. He smelled of expensive cologne and peppermint, a sharp, artificial scent that didn't belong in a valley of wood smoke and apples. "I heard about the notices. I came as soon as I could." He hugged her, and she felt the strength in his arms. Not the honest strength of a farmer, but the tension of a man who spent his life waiting for the right moment to strike. He looked up at the house, his eyes cold and appraising. "Dad always said the roof wouldn't last another winter. Looks like he was right." That evening, they sat in the dining room under the dim yellow light of a flickering bulb. Elias swirled a glass of amber liquid, his eyes fixed on her over the rim. He had a way of speaking that felt like a slow-acting poison, gentle and rhythmic. "Remember the year of the early frost, Marlin? You were supposed to smudge the South Quad. You fell asleep, didn't you? Lost 40% of the crop." Marlene looked down at the table, tracing a deep crack in the oak. "I was 16, Elias. I had the flu. Excuses don't fill bins, he whispered. He began to list her failures, one by one, reaching back into their childhood like a gravedigger. Every missed deadline, every bruised fruit, every late payment since Thomas died. He made her feel small, a child trying to play at being a provider. You're tired, sis. You're making mistakes. The neighbors are talking. They say you've lost your grip. The next morning, the silence of the farm was different. Usually, there was the low chatter of the picking crew, the sound of the radio in the bunkhouse. Marlin walked out to the trailers and found them empty. The doors swung open on their hinges, banging against the metal frames. On the communal table lay a single note from the foreman, a man who had worked for the Whitakers for 20 years. Elias appeared from the fog, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. They're gone, Marlin. I talked to them this morning. I told them the truth, that the checks might not clear. I helped them find work over at the Miller Orchard. They pay cash, daily. It was the right thing to do for them. Marlin felt a vein pulse in her temple. You sent them away? We start the main harvest tomorrow. I saved you the embarrassment of them walking out midweek, he said, taking a calm sip. You can't carry this, Marlin. Even Dad knew that. He told me right before he passed. He said you lacked the steel. Desperate to prove him wrong, she ran to the tractor. She had to get the bins moved, crew or no crew. She hammered the starter, but the engine only gave a sickening, wet thud. She jumped down, tearing the side panel off. The smell hit her, something sweet and thick. She reached into the fuel intake and pulled out a wad of sticky, blue-stained rags. Someone had stuffed the line with sugar-soaked cloth. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elias was standing there, wiping his hands on a clean white handkerchief. You're exhausted, he said, his voice a soothing drone. You probably left those rags there when you were cleaning the filters last night. You don't even remember doing it, do you? That's what sleep deprivation does to the brain. I didn't do this, she hissed. But her hand was shaking. The grease on her fingers looked like shadows. Come inside, he urged. I found some of Dad's old journals in the study. You should read what he wrote about the farm's future. It might help you accept the reality of the situation. In the study, the air was stale, smelling of old paper and the ghost of her father's tobacco. Elias had laid out the letters, the ones where their father had lamented Marlene's softness, her inability to make the hard choices. The words cut deeper than the bank notices. She felt the weight of the house pressing down on her, the expectations of generations of Whitakers collapsing into a single point of failure. Her. That night, unable to sleep, she walked out into the orchard. The moon was a sliver of bone behind the clouds. She reached the old well at the edge of the woods and heard a voice. Elias was there, his back to her, a cell phone pressed to his ear. No, she's holding on, but the pressure is working, he said, his tone brisk and professional. By the festival, she'll be ready to sign. Just make sure the corporate lawyers have the contingency ready. We get the commission, and the land is yours. Yeah, she's losing it. I've got her convinced she's sabotaging herself. Marlene froze. A dry twig snapped under her boot. Elias spun around, his face a mask of sudden, sharp aggression before he smoothed it into a fake smile. He tucked the phone away, his knuckles white. Marlene, why aren't you in bed? You're wandering again. Who were you talking to? The repair shop. Trying to get someone out for the tractor. Go back to sleep, sis. You look like a ghost. The next few days were a blur of escalating disasters. She called the rental agency for the festival tents. only to be told her reservation had been canceled by a family representative. Then the irrigation main blew. She found the pipes in the morning, the orchard floor a swamp of gray mud. The cuts in the heavy rubber weren't bursts. They were clean, diagonal slices made by a razor. Elias stood on the dry ground, watching her struggle in the muck. See? Everything is falling apart. You can't even keep the water in the pipes. It's a sign, Marlin. She retreated to the hangar to find some patching material, her mind racing. The building was dark, the air thick with the smell of sawdust. As she walked beneath the high-tier shelving, a sharp crack echoed through the space. A steel cable snapped, whipping through the air like a snake. The upper racks, loaded with hundreds of heavy wooden crates, groaned and tilted. Marlene dove sideways, just as the world turned into a roar of splintering pine. The impact shook the floor, a cloud of ancient dust choking her. She lay on the concrete, her heart a frantic bird, an inch from being crushed by a fallen beam. Elias was there in seconds, but he didn't check for injuries. He grabbed her by the arm, hauling her up with a violence that made her gasp. "You nearly killed yourself. You're a menace. Look at this mess. You can't even walk through a barn without causing a catastrophe." He dragged her into the house, shoving her into their father's old leather armchair. He produced a diary she hadn't seen before, reading passages in a voice that mimicked the old man's harsh growl. Marlene is a dreamer. She'll let the trees rot while she stares at the sunset. Elias is the only one who understands the value of $1. He hated me, she whispered, her spirit fracturing. He didn't hate you. He just knew you were weak, Elias said, leaning in until she could smell the mint on his breath. And now, you've proved him right. The storage lockers? I checked them an hour ago. The sensors failed. The temperature hit 90 degrees. Marlin ran to the cold storage, her boots slipping on the floor. When she opened the heavy steel door, a wave of heat hit her. Sweet, fermented, and foul. The Honeycrisps, her prize crop, were weeping. Thousands of gallons of juice leaked from the bins, a sticky, bubbling brown sludge that smelled of vinegar and death. She touched an apple. It dissolved into mush under her thumb. She sank to her knees in the rot, the fermented juice soaking into her clothes. Elias stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the light. He held a pen and a folder. "Sign it, Marlene. Sign it, and it all goes away. No more debt, no more rot, just peace." She looked at his shoes, perfectly clean, polished to a mirror shine. Then she looked at the computer glowing on the desk in the corner of his guest room, visible through the open door. A thought, cold and sharp as a pruning knife, pierced through her despair. I need a minute," she croaked. She waited until she heard the kettle whistling in the kitchen. She slipped into his room, her fingers flying over his laptop's trackpad. She didn't have to look far. The folders were labeled with clinical precision. Northwood correspondence, sabotage schedule, asset devaluation. She saw the emails. Damaged the tractor today. She's starting to doubt her memory. Moving on to the irrigation lines tonight. There were scans of checks from Northwood Agri-Systems made out to Elias Whitaker. A floorboard creaked behind her. She slammed the laptop shut, her heart leaping into her throat. She fumbled in her pocket, found a USB drive she'd used for farm accounts, and shoved it into the port, blind copying the sabotage folder just as the shadow of her brother fell across the threshold. "What are you doing in here?" Elias asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He held a cup of tea, the steam rising like a veil. "Looking for a pen," she lied, her voice trembling. He walked toward her, his presence filling the small room. He set the tea down and produced the final contract. The festival guests will be here in 3 hours. The press is already in town. You sign this now, or I tell everyone, the bank, the sheriff, the neighbors, that you've had a breakdown, that you're a danger to yourself. I'll have you committed, Marlene. I've already talked to the doctor in town. Marlene looked at the contract. She looked at the man who shared her blood. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. Okay, she whispered. I'll sign. Just let me get dressed for the guests. I want to look like a Whitaker one last time. The morning of the festival was a nightmare of gray light and false smiles. The yard was full of people, investors in long coats, neighbors looking for a scandal, and the man from Northwood, leaning on a silver-topped cane like a vulture waiting for a heart to stop beating. Elias was in his element. He stood on the porch, his voice booming over the crowd. "It is a somber day," he announced. "My sister, God bless her, has struggled. The loss of Thomas, it was too much. The farm has suffered. As you can see, the crop is lost. The equipment is ruined. For her safety and the preservation of the land, I am stepping in." Marlene stood beside him, her face a mask of grease and exhaustion. She saw Mr. Henderson, their oldest neighbor, turn away in shame. She felt the keys to the office being plucked from her pocket by Elias's quick fingers. "Come now, Marlene," Elias whispered, grabbing her arm. "Let's finish this inside." He marched her into the house and locked the door. The sound of the bolt was a finality she hadn't expected. He threw the papers onto the coffee table. "Sign it, now." "Dad didn't hate me," Marlene said, her voice suddenly steady. "He despised you. He told me you were a mistake." Elias screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her until her teeth rattled. "You are nothing. This land is wasted on you." He forced a pen into her hand, crushing her fingers around the barrel. "Sign it, or I swear to God, you'll never see the sun again without a barred window in front of it." Marlene looked at the pen. Then she looked at the hand crushing hers. With a sudden, violent twist, she drove the nib of the heavy fountain pen into the back of Elias's hand. He shrieked, a high, thin sound, and recoiled, clutching his bleeding palm. She didn't wait. She bolted for the door, her own key, the spare she'd hidden under the floorboard weeks ago, already in her hand. She burst out onto the porch, the cold air a benediction. She ran not to the crowd, but to the sound booth in the center of the festival grounds. Elias was close behind, shouting for the guards he'd hired. "Stop her, she's hysterical." Marlene reached the soundboard, tore away the tarp, and jammed the USB drive into the media player. She shoved the master fader to the top. The voice that exploded from the speakers wasn't hers. It was Elias's. The sugar in the tractor worked like a charm. "She's a wreck, crying in the dirt. The Northwood guys are happy. We'll have the title by Monday." The crowd froze. The man from Northwood tried to slink toward his car, but the picking crew, the men Elias had sent away, but who had returned at Marlene's secret request an hour earlier, blocked his path. Marlene grabbed the microphone. Her voice was a hammer, cold and rhythmic. "My name is Marlene Whitaker. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. My brother tried to kill it. My brother tried to kill me." She pointed to the giant screens where the presentation was supposed to be. Instead, the images of the sabotage logs, the checks, and the emails flickered in the gray light. The evidence was undeniable. A digital autopsy of a betrayal. Elias reached the stage, his face a ruin of fear and gore. "Marlene, wait. "Get off my land," she said, her voice amplified until it shook the very leaves on the trees. The neighbors, the men and women who had known her since she was a girl, moved in a single, silent wave. They didn't need a sheriff. They formed a wall of flannel and denim, a human tide that pushed Elias back, away from the stage, away from the house, toward the rusted gates. Marlene watched him go, a small, broken man disappearing into the mist. She turned to Mr. Henderson and the other local growers. "The crop in the lockers is gone," she said into the microphone. "But the North Orchard is still heavy. If we work together, if we form a cooperative, we can save the valley from the warehouses." She didn't wait for their answer. She knew it was coming. She walked to the top of the hill, to the old tree Thomas had loved most. The fog was breaking. A single ray of sun hit the Columbia River in the distance, turning the water into a ribbon of molten gold. She took the wedding ring from around her neck and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't need the weight of the past to hold her up anymore. She was a Whitaker. She was a farmer. And for the first time in her life, she was free.